Hey everyone, hope you're doing okay out there. I just want to talk to you about next week. Next week, we're going to be working on an argumentative essay, a three-part assignment where you're going to write an initial essay under timed conditions. You're going to do peer review and then a rewrite. So similar to what we did last time, this one's going to be a little more formal because both for the initial writing and the rewrite, you're going to have to do it within a 25-minute window. So the assignment will be set up as a quiz instead of just a regular assignment, and you'll have to really take care that you're prepared ahead of time. Now, the subject matter of the question is federalism, and later in this video, I'm going to do a screencast that goes through the outline. And you may remember that zip file that I sent out. It has a bunch of resources. The one you want to use is the AP exam review guide, and I think it's called AP Gov Review Packet Outline is what it's actually called. And you're going to be writing about this issue. Now, I will tell you the question involves national and state power. This is a major theme when the country was being founded, the difference between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists and the fear that they had. And then we almost right off the bat, we had cases, McCulloch versus Maryland, where there's an issue of, what types of power does the federal government have? So that'll be the topic later in this video. But just so you're prepared, we're getting awfully close to the exam date, and we're still waiting on what's going to happen for the rest of the year. Doesn't look like we're going to be able to have a large group review session. So hopefully these screencasts will give you some insight as to how to answer these questions. The other thing I want to do is I want to focus on, I made a new rubric. Hopefully it helps, and I want to go through that real quickly. Okay, so I sent a PDF file of this modified rubric. I think it's a lot easier to understand, and I created this just to, I think it's a lot easier than what the College Board put out. I don't know why they have to complicate the simple, but anyway, here it is. As you see, you have all of the components of the essay outlined here, thesis statement, and two pieces of evidence. So, and I just made a little yes/no column so you can see if you're doing all the things that are necessary to get the points. So, first of all, does it take a clear position? Does your thesis statement take a clear position? Does it establish a line of reasoning? If the answer is yes, then you get a point. Okay, it has to do both. It has to take a clear position. It can't be some muddled up response buried in a bunch of flowery language. Make it clear, make it concise, and make sure that it has a because statement where you establish your line of reasoning. The evidence. Is the evidence accurate? If it's accurate, the description and definition or explanation of your evidence, if it's accurate from the list, you get a point. If it is relevant to the line of reasoning, you get a point. If reasoning is used to explain why the evidence supports the thesis and line of reasoning, you get a third point. Okay, my strong recommendation is that you write in this exact order: thesis statement, first piece of evidence, relevance, reasoning. And then the same thing for your second piece of evidence. Is it accurate? Is it relevant? Is reasoning used? And if you do all that stuff, then that's your ticket to a 7 out of 7, which my guess is, given the craziness of this year, that's going to be a rare commodity for people to get all 7 points. Hopefully this group will hit it out of the park, but hopefully this rubric helps you. I've also included a good practices checklist. I see a lot of things that I, just in grading them, that I want to avoid the next time around. So here we go. Do you avoid the use of first person? You don't want to use I believe, I think, or any kind of editorial references, commentary, opinion, or anything like that. Keep it simple and avoid first person. Does the essay use appropriate paragraphs and spacing? This drives me crazy when people write in just a big block. It's so much better when your essay is organized and utilizes paragraphs in appropriate spacing. Does the essay use meaningful examples that support the line of reasoning? This is your ticket to the reasoning point. Just try to plug in examples. The last essay that was assigned, there were some easy examples, historical examples of powers Congress, laws that Congress had passed that advance equality, and people are just not using them. I don't understand why. So examples are the ticket to a good quality essay, and it's an easy way to make sure you have your reasoning points. Is it appropriate length? You don't want it to be overly wordy, but you don't want it to be too abbreviated. So kind of go for a happy medium. It has to, and then finally, is it possible to write within the allotted time? It's a very different experience writing an exam under timed conditions, so that's why we're going to practice that next week. All right, for starters, this is the zip file that I was referring to earlier. It's got all of the course materials, and this AP Gov review packet outline is what we're going to be using quite a bit from here on out as we get closer to the exam. So make sure you have that handy, and I think it's going to be a lot easier as we go through this. So, and also you're going to want your Constitution and possibly the required readings packet. Okay, so this is the review outline, and again, I just want to talk through some of these things because the FRQ that you're going to be assigned next week deals with federal-state relations and the growth of national power. So first of all, you may remember that it's been a long time, but the when the country was initially founded, it was founded as a confederacy, and the Articles of Confederation was established as the type of government we're going to have, a confederacy. So this confederacy is a type of government where the states have all the power. Under the Articles of Confederation, and again, that's one of your required readings, the Articles of Confederation, which, by the way, you know, I wouldn't worry too much about the Articles of Confederation just because it's not necessary to know all the details, but there it is. But you need to know the basics, so let's just real quickly go over the basics in the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation established a unicameral legislature, and almost all power was held by the states. So you may remember the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. The national government didn't have any power to tax. They didn't have any judiciary. There was no president like we have today. And it just generally created a weak, ineffective government that was soon revealed as such when Shays' Rebellion occurred, where an uprising was taking place and there wasn't a national military to deal with it. So that was kind of the wake-up call that caused people to kind of rethink whether that was such a good idea. Okay, so just remember, you don't need to know much more than that. You know, unicameral legislature, very, very weak national government, really not a national government to speak of at all. Okay, so, and of course, the issue is if you recognize that a confederacy was not going to work, well then what do you have? And of course what the United States was founded upon with the Constitution is a federal system of government where you have a national government and states with the national having a little bit more of an edge in terms of power, as we're going to talk about. This was a major issue of controversy between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Brutus won. The author was absolutely apoplectic about the necessary and proper clause and the supremacy clause, and again, we're not going to go into all those details in this screencast, but it was a major area of controversy, and it still is. So federal-state relations has always been, in fact, we're seeing that right now with this pandemic response. Some of the state governors are not happy with what's happening at the federal level, and we see that tension even to this very day. Okay, so looking at our objectives here explain the relationship between key provisions of the Articles and the debate over granting the federal government greater power formerly reserved to the states. And again, just remember Shays' Rebellion and this inability to tax was a major problem. This guide is good because it has some practice questions too, so let's just look at these questions. In the 1780s, proponents of the new Constitution cited Shays' Rebellion as an example in support of which of the following criticisms of the national government under the Articles of Confederation. So, was it the national government did not provide sufficient protection for individual rights, lack of a centralized judiciary made enforcement of national laws difficult, states with larger populations were underrepresented in Congress, there was a lack of national military power to address security concerns. And again, there's a lot of criticisms here that the Anti-Federalists levied, but this one in particular is directed towards this idea of lack of military power. All right, let's jump ahead to the material on federalism. And we have an enduring understanding. Federalism reflects a dynamic distribution of power between national and state governments. Explain how societal needs affect the constitutional allocation of power between the national and state governments. Okay, so this is where we're probably going to want to jump over to the Constitution and take a look at that. But let's look at the outline first. The exclusive and concurrent powers of the national and state governments help to explain negotiations over the balance of power between the two levels. So we have exclusive powers, we have concurrent powers. The distribution of power between federal and state governments to meet the needs of society changes as reflected by grants, incentives, and aid programs, including federal revenue sharing mandates, categorical grants, and block grants. So we're going to get into all that stuff in just a minute. First of all, going over to the Constitution, let's look at Article 1, Section 8. Article 1, Section 8 is the powers of Congress, and you'll notice the very first one is the power to tax. This was a power that was lacking in the Articles of Confederation, and I've said many times during class that this is kind of like a cheat sheet for what was wrong with the Articles of Confederation. They couldn't tax, they couldn't borrow, they couldn't regulate commerce. All of those things were things that the states were supposed to do under the Articles, and of course there was a lot of problems. But the one element of Article 1, Section 8 that just set the Anti-Federalists off was this necessary and proper clause. Because look what it says: to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. When you combine that with another part of the Constitution, Article 6, which is the Supremacy Clause, this Constitution and the laws of the United States, so should be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land. This is what's known as the Supremacy Clause. Okay. So, once again, the essay that you're going to be dealing with deals with federal-state relations and specifically the growth of national power and whether that's okay. So I want to just now kind of talk generally about that. We're going to step away from the outline, and I just want to go over a few thoughts in how to prepare for this essay. All right, the first major case that came up that really hit the issue of federal-state relations was McCulloch versus Maryland. And I don't want to go into all the details of it, but you may remember that this was a dispute over whether the United States government, the national government, could establish a bank. And so the state of Maryland had tried to tax the banknotes issued by this bank, and the question became, is this a proper use of power? And in other words, does the federal government actually have this power? Now, they don't have the power to create a bank, but they do have the power to coin money. So, and again, look at the issue. Did Congress have the authority under the Constitution to commission a national bank? If so, did the state of Maryland have the authority to tax a branch of the national bank? So this is an absolute must-know case to answer a question about basic federalism stuff. The court ruled that the necessary and proper clause authorized the government to create the bank. It was an implied power. It was the first time the court had recognized the use of implied powers. So very, very important case. All right, so after McCulloch versus Maryland, there was another case you may remember called Gibbons versus Ogden, which involved steamboat licensing and whether a nationally issued license was superior to a state issued license. And of course, the answer was that the national license, because of the supremacy clause, was superior. Now, this was just yet another thing that sent the anti-federalists off the edge, because it was just fulfillment of what was basically warned about in Brutus I. After that case, now that it was established that only the national government can regulate interstate commerce, it took a little time, but eventually there was a growing call for more regulation by the national government, starting with railroads. And as we got into the modern age and the industrial age, more and more regulations. Now, for years, the court was reluctant to grant that the Congress had all of these types of powers. But over time, there, you may remember, we talked about the use of the Commerce Clause. It was basically established that Congress could regulate almost anything if it amounted to regulating interstate commerce. And I would suggest that you read the review topics on this for more information on that. But you know, for the purpose of this screencast, think of McCulloch versus Maryland and the Gibbons case as kind of the starting point. And then after the New Deal, there were all kinds of regulations passed by the national government that affected the states. So the question that you're going to be grappling with next week really deals with, is this okay? Or should there be more deference to the states in regards to certain policies? Because some of the policies of the states were reversed because of national policy. And by the way, a lot of those we wouldn't question today by any stretch. No one would question that the Civil Rights Movement was not necessary. So the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act and things like that, those are clear federal laws that affect the states, but in a very positive way. But it was an intrusion upon state power, even though we don't really think about it anymore, because we just accept that those are, you know, positive things that the national government has done. So to really fully understand the question, it's also important to think about some policy areas where the states may be feeling like their rights were abused. So I want to talk about another aspect of federal state power and where that power comes from, and that, of course, is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has issued numerous rulings that impact the states. One of them that we studied was the Gideon case, which involved the right to counsel, the right to a lawyer in a criminal matter. And again, I don't think anyone's going to question that ruling. It was a 9-0 ruling, but again, it forced the states to pay for defense lawyers where previously they hadn't done so. Now, regarding the Supreme Court, there's also some controversial cases. Roe versus Wade. That's a very divisive issue to this day. And it did reverse the policies of nearly all of the states. 47 states had policies restricting or in some cases banning abortions. And then, of course, Roe versus Wade reversed that using this idea of substantive due process. So in answering a question about whether the expansion of national power is okay, you need to be thinking about some of the things that they have done. Now, there's a ton of other stuff where the national government has impacted the states, paying for road construction, things like that. Federal grants and aid, paying for, you know, welfare programs perhaps, or school lunch programs, things like that. And so, again, sometimes it's difficult to see why any of that could be a negative. But when the national government exerts power, don't forget it's at the expense of the states. So the 10th Amendment gives the states power where the national government does not exercise power. So anyway, these are just some things to think about in writing your essay. If you're a believer that the national government has overstepped its bounds, you might want to rely on maybe some of the court cases that are controversial in making that point. But if you're going to argue that the expansion of power is a benefit to our country and our society and to policies that are put forth, there's lots of examples that you can plug into. All right, so hopefully this helps out. You're going to be on the spot next week with this argumentative essay. The stakes are getting higher. It's getting closer and closer to the exam. So I would definitely review Unit 1 regarding federalism before you attempt to answer the question. All right, hope this helps.